a barefoot little girl exploded from the fog-soaked forest, throwing herself in front of a convoy of black luxury cars, screaming that men were burying her mother alive in the woods behind her. She didn't know the man stepping out of that lead vehicle was Roberto Medino, a heavily tattooed mafia boss whose name was whispered, never spoken. But instead of brushing her aside, he did something no one expected. He listened. And then he turned toward the forest and said 2 words, "Show me." Now the men who dug that grave are about to discover they made 3 fatal mistakes. They chose the wrong victim, the wrong road, and the wrong man to cross. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. All right, let's get back into it. The fog was thick enough to swallow headlights whole. It rolled low over the forest road that morning, moving like something deliberate, something patient. The mist clung to the towering trees, turning ancient pines into dark sentinels that loomed over the asphalt. Sound died in that fog, absorbed, muffled, held captive. The air tasted of wet bark and cold earth, sharp enough to burn the throat. Everything felt suspended, caught between dawn and darkness. Then she came. The little girl burst through the gray wall like a body breaking the surface of deep water. Her burgundy dress, once vibrant, now torn at the hem and mud-caked, clung to her thin frame as she ran, barefoot, her small feet pounding against the wet pavement, leaving smears of dirt and streaks of blood that the fog swallowed behind her. Her arms pumped wildly, desperately, her chest heaving with sobs that sounded more like screams caught in her throat. Her light brown hair whipped around her face, tangled with leaves and debris. She wasn't lost. She was fleeing. And she ran straight toward the convoy of black luxury cars that had just rounded the bend, 3 sleek vehicles moving in formation through the mist like shadows with engines. The lead car's headlights caught her, turned her into a ghost outlined in white light. She didn't stop. She didn't hesitate. She threw her body in front of that car and screamed. The convoy stopped. Car doors opened with synchronized precision. Men in dark suits emerged, hands instinctively moving toward concealed weapons. They formed a protective perimeter, eyes scanning the tree line, the fog, the road ahead and behind. Their breath formed small clouds in the cold air. Their faces showed nothing, no surprise, no concern, only trained vigilance, but they all watched him. Roberto Medino stepped out of the lead car with the kind of calm that made dangerous men nervous. Tall, imposing in an immaculate black coat that looked like it cost more than most cars. The fabric didn't have a wrinkle, didn't show a speck of the mud that coated everything else. Tattoos crawled up his neck from beneath his black collar, intricate, dark patterns that looked almost alive in the gray light. His dark hair was slicked back perfectly, not a strand out of place despite the damp air. His face was all sharp angles and controlled stillness, his jawline carved like stone. His dark eyes settled on the child who had collapsed to her knees in front of him, gasping, sobbing, her small hands pressed against the wet pavement. She looked up at him with eyes that had seen things no child should see, wide, terrified, but not of him, of what was behind her in those trees. "Please," she choked out, her voice raw and breaking. The word came out strangled, barely audible over her ragged breathing. "Please don't go. They're going to bury my mom alive." Her whole body shook. "She's still breathing, I heard her. I heard her under the dirt. Please, save her." Roberto Medino didn't move, didn't speak. One of his men stepped forward, hand extended to pull the girl away. "Boss, we need to..." Roberto raised one finger. The man froze mid-step. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The fog pressed closer. Roberto's men tensed, waiting for the order to remove her, to keep moving, to pretend they'd never seen her. This wasn't their world. Lost children, buried mothers, these were complications. Liabilities. Things that attracted attention they couldn't afford. But Roberto's stillness wasn't indifference. It was calculation. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the girl. The torn burgundy dress, the bloody feet, the scratches on her legs that looked fresh, violent, the dirt under her fingernails, the leaves caught in her hair. She'd been running through dense forest, not along roads. The mud on her knees was the kind that came from digging, not falling. She'd tried to dig her mother out herself. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Something flickered behind those cold eyes, something old, something that looked like recognition or regret. The girl's chest heaved with another sob. "They said nobody would come. They said nobody would stop." Her voice cracked. But you stopped. You stopped. Roberto's hands remained at his sides, relaxed but ready. His breathing stayed even, but his gaze shifted from the girl to the wall of trees behind her, to the dark forest swallowing the road's edge. Somewhere in there, if she was telling the truth, was a woman buried alive, slowly suffocating, slowly dying while her daughter ran for help that might never come. His men waited, the girl waited, the forest waited. Then Roberto turned his head fully toward the trees, his profile sharp against the fog. His voice, when it came, was quiet, controlled, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "Show me." The girl's eyes went wide. For a moment, she didn't move, as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. Then she scrambled to her feet, wincing as her torn soles touched the pavement. She pointed toward a gap in the trees, a narrow path barely visible through the mist. "There," she gasped. "Not far. Maybe 10 minutes. I ran so fast. Please hurry. Please." Roberto nodded once. He turned to his men, and his voice remained low but absolute. "Victor, Andre, with me. The rest stay with the cars." Eyes open. The 2 men he'd named moved immediately, checking weapons, adjusting their suits. They were older than the others, faces weathered, eyes that had seen violence and delivered it. They didn't question. They simply prepared. Roberto looked down at the girl one more time. "What's your name?" "Naomi," she whispered. "Naomi Mesa." "Naomi," Roberto repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Lead the way." The girl turned and ran back toward the forest, her small frame disappearing into the fog like a ghost returning to haunt the woods. Roberto followed, his black coat cutting through the mist, his men flanking him like shadows. The convoy stayed behind, engines still running, headlights boring holes in the gray nothing. And the forest swallowed them whole. Naomi moved through the forest like something feral, her small body weaving between trees with desperate precision. Roberto followed, his expensive shoes sinking into mud that grabbed at every step. Victor and Andre flanked him, weapons drawn but lowered, their eyes scanning the darkness between the pines. The fog was thicker here, clinging to everything like wet cloth. It turned the world into fragments, a branch here, a rock there. Nothing whole, nothing clear. The forest floor was a maze of exposed roots and hidden holes, treacherous even in daylight. In this gray twilight, it felt like walking through someone else's nightmare. "How much farther?" Roberto's voice cut through the silence. Naomi didn't turn around. "Close, very close." Her voice cracked. "I can still hear her. I can still hear her breathing." Roberto's jaw tightened. The girl was running on pure terror, on hope that was probably already dead. He'd seen this before, desperate people clinging to impossible outcomes, refusing to accept what their minds already knew. But he kept walking. He'd made his choice back on that road. The trees opened suddenly into a small clearing. Natural or man-made, Roberto couldn't tell. But the ground here had been disturbed. Recently. Violently. Naomi stopped so abruptly Roberto nearly collided with her. She pointed with a shaking hand. "There." At first, Roberto saw nothing but churned earth and scattered leaves. Then his eyes adjusted, found the pattern in the chaos. A rectangular patch of ground, maybe 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, fresh dirt piled at one end. And in the center, movement. Shallow, almost imperceptible, but movement. The dirt was breathing. "Mother of God," Victor whispered behind him. Roberto was already moving. He dropped to his knees at the edge of the disturbed earth, his coat dragging through the mud. His hands found the dirt, started pulling it away in handfuls. It was loose, recently placed, but there was so much of it. "Dig," he snapped. Victor and Andre were beside him instantly, their hands tearing through soil and leaves. Naomi fell to her knees across from them, her small fingers scraping at the earth with frantic energy, sobbing as she dug. "Mom," she kept saying. "Mom, we're here. We're here." Roberto's hands hit something solid. Fabric. He pulled harder, clearing dirt away from what looked like a shoulder, then a neck, then a face. The woman's face was tilted upward, mouth packed with a gag that had been shoved so deep Roberto could see it bulging against her throat. Her eyes were closed, skin pale as death, lips tinged blue. Dirt covered everything, her hair, her cheeks, filling her nostrils. But her chest moved. Barely. A flutter so faint it could have been imagination. "She's alive," Roberto said. His voice was steady, but something in his chest tightened. "Get her out. Now." They dug faster. The woman had been buried to her chest, her arms bound behind her back, legs tied at the ankles. Whoever did this wanted her to suffocate slowly, wanted her to feel every second of dirt pressing down, wanted her last moments to be pure terror. Roberto's hands moved with surgical precision, clearing dirt from her face, her neck, her shoulders. Victor and Andre worked at her torso, pulling away layers of earth. Naomi dug at her mother's side, crying so hard she could barely breathe. "I'm sorry, Mama," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I ran as fast as I could. I'm sorry." Roberto grasped the woman's shoulders and pulled. She came free with a wet, sucking sound, her body limp and cold. He laid her flat on the ground, immediately checking for breathing. Her chest barely moved. He pulled the gag from her mouth, had to work it carefully. It was wedged so deep and dirt poured out with it. "Get the bindings," he ordered. Andre had a knife out, slicing through rope at her wrists and ankles. The moment her arms came free, they flopped to her sides, lifeless. Victor was checking her pulse, his fingers pressed against her throat. "It's there," he said quietly. "Weak, but there." Roberto tilted the woman's head back, clearing more dirt from her airways. Her lips were cracked, bleeding. Her skin was like ice. How long had she been under? 20 minutes? 30? Long enough for hypothermia to set in, for oxygen deprivation to do damage that might never heal. Naomi crawled to her mother's side, her small hands touching her face, her hair, her shoulders. "Mama, Mama, please wake up, please." The woman's eyelids fluttered. Roberto saw at first the subtle twitch, the slight movement beneath closed lids. Then her mouth opened, and she gasped. It wasn't a breath, it was drowning in reverse, her body remembering how to pull air into lungs that had been fighting dirt for too long. She coughed, violently. More dirt came up, black and wet. Her whole body convulsed with the effort, her back arching off the ground. Naomi screamed, thinking her mother was dying right there in front of her. But Roberto held the woman steady, turning her on her side so she wouldn't choke. "Let it out," he said quietly. "Get it all out." The woman coughed for what felt like minutes, each spasm racking her thin frame. Finally, her breathing evened out, still shallow, still labored, but regular. Her eyes opened. They were gray, terrified, confused. They found Naomi first. "Baby," the woman whispered. Her voice was destroyed, barely audible. "Run. You have to run." "It's okay, Mama." Naomi was crying so hard she could barely speak. "You're safe." "This man," he stopped. "He helped us." The woman's eyes shifted to Roberto. She stared at him, taking in the tattoos, the cold face, the expensive coat now ruined with mud and dirt. Her expression didn't change. She'd seen men like him before, known what they were capable of. "Who did this?" Roberto asked. The woman's jaw trembled. She tried to speak, coughed instead. Victor offered a flask of water. Roberto held it to her lips, let her sip carefully. She tried again. I don't know their names." "Why?" Roberto pressed. "Why you?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "The land. They wanted my land. I wouldn't sell." Roberto went very still. His men exchanged glances. They knew that look. They'd seen it before, right before entire operations disappeared overnight. "How many men?" Roberto asked quietly. 4, maybe 5. The woman shuddered. They said no one would find me, until it was too late, that no one would care. She looked at Naomi, touched her daughter's face with shaking fingers. They said even if she ran, no one would stop. Roberto stood slowly. His coat was destroyed, his hands black with dirt. He looked at the shallow grave, at the pile of earth that had nearly become a tomb, at the ropes that had bound a woman while men buried her alive. "They were wrong," he said. They carried Naomi's mother back through the forest in silence. Victor had given the woman his jacket, wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. She could barely walk, her legs giving out every few steps, so Roberto lifted her himself. She weighed almost nothing, her body cold and rigid with shock. Naomi stayed close, one hand gripping her mother's arm, refusing to let go even for a second. Her eyes darted constantly to the trees around them, expecting masked men to emerge from the fog at any moment. When they reached the convoy, Roberto's remaining men reacted immediately. One pulled blankets from the trunk, another produced a medical kit, a third was already on the phone, voice low and urgent, arranging things Roberto didn't need to explain. Roberto laid the woman carefully in the back seat of the middle car. The interior lights made her look worse, skin gray, lips still blue, eyes unfocused and distant. She was breathing, but barely present. "Hospital?" Victor asked quietly. "No." Roberto's voice was firm. "They'll ask questions we can't answer. And if the men who did this have people watching hospitals..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Victor nodded. "The safe house on Meridian? Get her there. Get a doctor. Someone discreet." Roberto turned to Andre. "Stay with them. No one gets close." As his men prepared to move the woman, Roberto knelt beside the open car door. Naomi was inside, sitting next to her mother, still holding her hand. The girl's face was streaked with dirt and tears, her burgundy dress ruined beyond repair. "What's your mother's name?" Roberto asked. "Nancy," Naomi whispered. "Nancy Mesa." Roberto looked at Nancy. Her eyes were open but glassy, staring at nothing. He'd seen that look before, the aftermath of trauma so severe, the mind simply left the body for a while. She was alive, but some part of her was still in that grave, still feeling dirt fill her lungs. "Nancy," Roberto said quietly. She didn't respond. He tried again, firmer. "Nancy, look at me." Slowly, her eyes focused. Found his face. "You're safe now," Roberto told her. "My men are taking you somewhere secure. A doctor will see you. You're going to survive this." Nancy's lips moved. No sound came out at first. Then, barely audible, "Why?" "Because your daughter asked me to help." Roberto stood. "And because the men who did this made a mistake." He closed the car door, watched as the vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the fog with Victor at the wheel. Andre followed in the third car. That left Roberto with 2 men and the lead vehicle, and questions that needed answers. Roberto turned to the remaining men. "The lookout. He's still here?" One of them nodded toward the tree line. "Tied up, 30 meters in. Caught him watching the burial site from cover. He saw us digging." "Good." Roberto's voice went cold. "Bring him." They dragged the man out 2 minutes later. He was young, maybe 25, dressed in dark clothes that were meant to blend with the forest. His face was swollen on one side where someone had hit him, probably to keep him quiet. His eyes went wide when he saw Roberto. "Please," the man started. I wasn't." Roberto raised a hand. The man's words died in his throat. "You were watching the grave," Roberto said. It wasn't a question. The man nodded frantically. "Just watching. Making sure no one came by. That's all, I swear. Making sure no one found her before she died." Roberto's voice was flat. "That was your job." The man's face went pale. "I didn't hurt her. I didn't dig. You just made sure she suffocated alone in the dark." Roberto stepped closer. "Tell me who gave the order." "I can't. They'll kill me." Roberto's expression didn't change. "I'm standing right in front of you." "They're not. Choose carefully." The man's breath came in short, panicked gasps. His eyes darted between Roberto's face and the guns his men were holding. The math was simple. Talk and maybe die later. Stay silent and definitely die now. "It was Dmitri," he blurted. "Dmitri Volkov. He's the one who ordered it. He handles property acquisitions for the network." "What network?" "The transport network. They move things through here. Drugs, weapons, people sometimes." The words tumbled out faster now, desperate to stay useful, to stay alive. "The Mesa woman owns land right on the route. She wouldn't sell. Dmitri said she needed to be persuaded." "And burial is persuasion?" Roberto's voice dropped lower. It was supposed to be a warning. Bury her for a few hours, then dig her up, scare her enough to sell. The man was shaking now. "But Dmitri said..." He said maybe it was better to just let her die. Make an example. Show other landowners what happens when they refuse. Roberto went very still. His men recognized that stillness. It was the moment before storms broke, before violence became inevitable. "Who else knows about this?" Roberto asked quietly. "Just the crew. 4 of us, plus Dmitri. Names." The man gave them. Roberto committed each one to memory, his mind already working through connections, hierarchies, who answered to whom. Dmitri Volkov wasn't a name he knew, which meant the man operated in circles Roberto hadn't touched yet. Regional, mid-level, dangerous enough to order killings but not important enough to have Roberto's protection or fear his reputation. That was about to change. "Where's Dmitri now?" "I don't know. He moves around, changes locations. But he'll be back tonight to check the site, make sure the job was finished." Roberto nodded slowly. He turned to his men. "Take him to the warehouse on 5th. Keep him comfortable. Keep him alive. He's going to tell us everything he knows about Dimitri's operation. What about the crew? One of his men asked. The ones who did the digging? Roberto looked back toward the forest, toward the spot where Nancy Mesa had been buried alive, where her daughter had clawed at dirt with bleeding hands. They'll come back, Roberto said quietly. Men like that always come back, to cover their tracks, to make sure the evidence is gone. He checked his watch. Early afternoon. If the lookout was right, they had hours before Dimitri returned, hours to prepare. Get everyone in position, Roberto ordered. No one leaves these woods alive unless I say otherwise. His men moved immediately, making calls, checking weapons, preparing for what was coming. Roberto stood alone for a moment, staring into the fog-wrapped forest. Somewhere in there, a grave stood open, empty now, but it wouldn't stay empty for long. The safe house on Meridian Street looked like every other building on the block, worn brick, narrow windows, forgettable. That was the point. Roberto's car pulled up just as dusk started creeping in, turning the fog from gray to purple. Victor met him at the door. The doctor just left. Says she'll survive, but it was close. Another 10 minutes and we'd be having a different conversation. Roberto nodded, stepping inside. The house smelled like antiseptic and old wood. He moved through a narrow hallway, past a kitchen where 2 of his men sat watching the street through cracked blinds, and up a staircase that creaked under his weight. The bedroom was on the 2nd floor. Small, clean. A single lamp cast warm light across faded wallpaper. Nancy Mesa lay in the bed, propped up on pillows, an IV line running into her arm. Her color had improved, no longer death gray, but pale enough to look fragile. Her eyes were closed, her breathing steady but shallow. The doctor had cleaned the dirt from her hair, bandaged the rope burns on her wrists and ankles. Naomi sat in a chair beside the bed, still wearing that ruined burgundy dress. Someone had cleaned her feet, wrapped them in white gauze. Her hand rested on her mother's arm, fingers curled gently around the IV line's tape. She looked up when Roberto entered. Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted, but alert. Is she going to be okay? Naomi's voice was barely a whisper. The doctor says yes. Roberto remained in the doorway, not entering fully. This wasn't his space. It belonged to them, mother and daughter, survivors trying to remember how to breathe. She keeps having nightmares, Naomi said quietly. Every time she falls asleep, she wakes up screaming, like she's still down there. Roberto's jaw tightened. He knew about nightmares, about the ones that followed you out of dark places and never quite let go. It will take time, he said. Naomi studied him with eyes that seemed older than they should be. Why did you stop? Back on the road. Why didn't you just keep driving? The question hung in the air between them. Roberto could have deflected, could have said something about duty or timing or coincidence. But something about the way she looked at him direct, unflinching, demanding truth made lies feel impossible. Because once, Roberto said slowly, someone asked me for help, and I didn't stop. Naomi waited. She understood there was more. Roberto stepped into the room, but stayed near the door. His expensive coat was gone, replaced with a simple black shirt. The tattoos on his neck looked darker in the lamplight, like they were moving. It was 7 years ago. Different road, different forest. His voice was flat, stripped of emotion. I was younger then, angrier. I thought the world was simple. You took care of your own problems, no one else's. He paused, remembering details he'd spent years trying to forget. There was a boy, maybe 9 years old. He ran out just like you did, barefoot, crying, begging. Roberto's hands clenched at his sides. He said his father was being beaten in the woods, that men were going to kill him, that he needed help right now or his father would die. Naomi's eyes were fixed on Roberto's face. I told my driver to keep moving, Roberto continued. The boy grabbed the door handle, tried to hold on. We dragged him a few feet before he let go. He exhaled slowly. I told myself it wasn't my business, that getting involved in other people's wars would only complicate mine, that the boy would find someone else. Did he? Naomi asked quietly. No. Roberto's voice went colder. They found his body 3 days later, next to his father's. Both shot, both left in a ditch like garbage. The room fell silent except for Nancy's shallow breathing and the distant sound of traffic outside. I didn't know about the bodies right away, Roberto said. Not until weeks later. By then, I'd forgotten the boy's face. Almost convinced myself he'd never existed. He looked directly at Naomi, but But I never forgot the sound of him screaming as we drove away. Naomi's grip on her mother's arm tightened. After that, I made a rule, Roberto said. If a child asks me for help directly, desperately, I don't drive away. Ever. I don't care what I'm doing, where I'm going, or what it costs me. His voice hardened. That's why I stopped. Naomi absorbed this in silence. Then, slowly, she asked, "Do you think about him? The boy, every day?" Roberto's answer was immediate. Honest. Every single day. A sound came from the bed. Both of them turned. Nancy's eyes had opened, focusing slowly on Roberto's face. She'd been listening. For how long, Roberto didn't know. "You're not here out of kindness," Nancy whispered, her voice still raw. "You're here because of guilt." Roberto didn't flinch. "Does it matter?" "Yes." Nancy's eyes filled with tears. "Because guilt is honest. Guilt is real. People who claim they help out of kindness are lying to themselves." She swallowed hard, wincing at the pain in her throat. "Thank you for your guilt." Roberto nodded once. He turned to leave, but Naomi's voice stopped him. "Do monsters ever help people?" she asked. "Or does helping people mean you're not a monster?" Roberto looked back at her. At this small girl who'd run through a forest alone, who'd clawed at dirt with bleeding hands, who'd thrown herself in front of dangerous men and demanded they save her mother. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I know this, the world has lots of monsters. Some bury people alive, some stand and watch, and some," he paused, "some try to dig them back out. Which one are you?" Naomi pressed. Roberto's expression remained unchanged. "All three, at different times, in different ways." He moved toward the door. "Get some rest, both of you. You're safe here." "For how long?" Nancy asked from the bed. Roberto stopped in the doorway. "Until the men who did this are no longer a problem. And then you disappear. New names, new city, new life." His tone left no room for argument. "The land isn't worth dying for. It's all we have," Nancy said quietly. "You have your daughter," Roberto replied. "That's all that matters." He left before either of them could respond. Descended the stairs, nodded to his men in the kitchen, stepped back into the fog-wrapped evening. Victor was waiting by the car. The crew is in position at the burial site. Dimitri's expected within the hour. Roberto slid into the back seat. His face was carved from stone again, the brief moment of vulnerability gone. "Then let's not keep him waiting," he said. The forest was darker now. The fog had thickened as evening settled, turning the trees into black shapes that seemed to lean inward, watching. Roberto stood 20 meters from the open grave, hidden behind a massive pine, invisible in his dark clothes. Victor was positioned to his left, Andre to his right. 3 more men formed a loose perimeter around the clearing, silent as the dead. They'd been waiting for 40 minutes. No one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. This was what they were trained for. The patience before violence, the stillness before storms broke. Roberto's phone buzzed once. A text from the warehouse. The lookout had given up more information. Dmitry Volkov wasn't just handling property acquisitions. He was the regional coordinator for an entire smuggling network that stretched from the coast to 3 inland cities. The land Nancy Mesa owned sat directly on a route that saved the operation hours and thousands in fuel costs. One woman's refusal to sell had threatened millions in revenue. So they'd decided to bury her. Roberto slipped the phone back into his pocket. His hand moved to the weapon holstered under his jacket, checking it was there, ready. He didn't expect to need it, not yet, but preparation was the difference between walking away and being carried out. A sound cut through the silence. Distant. Engines. Victor's voice came through the earpiece, barely a whisper. 2 vehicles, coming from the east access road. Roberto's eyes stayed fixed on the clearing, on the grave still open like a wound in the earth. He'd ordered his men not to fill it. Leave it exactly as they'd found it. Let Dmitry see what had been uncovered. Let him understand his mistake. The engines grew louder, then stopped. Car doors opened and closed. Voices carried through the trees, low, casual, unconcerned. Men who thought they were alone, returning to finish a job. 4 figures emerged from the fog into the clearing. They carried shovels, flashlights, a large tarp. One of them laughed at something another said. The sound was wrong here. Obscene, against what this place had witnessed. They stopped when they saw the grave. "What the hell?" The first man's voice went sharp. He moved closer, shining his flashlight into the empty pit. "She's gone. The dirt's been moved. Another man knelt beside the grave, examining the displaced earth. Recently. Look at this, these are handprints. Someone dug her out. The kid, a third man said. Has to be. Little bitch must have found help. The fourth man pulled out a phone. We need to call Dimitri. Now. He's already on his way, the first man said. Should be here in 10 minutes. We were supposed to have this cleaned up before he arrived. He kicked at the pile of dirt. Damn it, he's going to be furious. Maybe she died anyway, the second man offered. Even if someone dug her out, she was under for a while. Could have been too late. Doesn't matter. The first man's voice hardened. We need to find that kid. She's the only witness. Her mother's probably dead or useless by now. But the girl saw our faces. She's what, 7? 8? The third man shrugged. Who's going to believe her? You want to take that chance? The first man started pacing. We find her. We finish this. Then we disappear for a few weeks until things cool down. Roberto had heard enough. He stepped out of the shadows. The 4 men spun toward him, hands reaching for weapons. But Roberto's men emerged from the trees simultaneously, 6 armed figures materializing from fog and darkness, forming a circle around the clearing. The first man's hand froze halfway to his jacket. His eyes went wide as he took in Roberto's face, the tattoos, the cold certainty in his stance. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, trying to sound authoritative but failing. Roberto didn't answer. He walked slowly toward the open grave, his footsteps deliberate, unhurried. He stopped at the edge, looking down into the pit where Nancy Mesa had nearly died. "You buried a woman here this morning," Roberto said quietly. "Alive, bound, gagged. You packed dirt over her face and left her to suffocate." The 4 men exchanged glances. The second one tried to bluff. "I don't know what you're talking about." Roberto turned his head, his dark eyes settling on the man. "Her name is Nancy Mesa. Her daughter is named Naomi. The girl is 8 years old. She has brown hair and was wearing a burgundy dress when she ran 5 miles through this forest to find help." The first man's face had gone pale. "Look, whoever you are, this is business. It's not personal." The woman was warned. She refused to cooperate. "So you tried to kill her." Roberto's voice remained flat. "And you would have killed her daughter too, to eliminate witnesses." "We're just contractors," the third man said quickly. "We do what we're told. You want someone to be angry at? Talk to Dimitri." He gave the orders. "I will," Roberto assured him. "But first I'm talking to you." The fourth man's nerve broke. He pulled a gun, brought it up fast, aimed at Roberto's chest. He never got the shot off. Victor's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. The gun flew from his hand, disappeared into the fog. The man screamed, clutching his arm, blood pouring between his fingers. The other 3 froze. "Next one goes through your head," Victor called out calmly. "Drop your weapons. Now." Guns and knives hit the ground. The 3 standing men raised their hands slowly. The wounded one knelt in the dirt, still screaming. Roberto approached the first man, the one who'd been giving orders. "What's your name?" "Go to hell." Roberto nodded. Victor moved forward, grabbed the man's hand, bent his fingers back at an angle that made joints crack. The man gasped, dropping to his knees. "Your name," Roberto repeated. "Alexei," the man choked out. "Alexei Petrov." "Alexei, you're going to tell me everything about Dimitri's operation. Where he works, where he lives, who he reports to, who pays him." Roberto's voice was cold as the fog. "And you're going to tell me the names of everyone involved in what happened to Nancy Mesa." "I can't," Alexei gasped. "They'll kill me." Roberto knelt down until his face was level with Alexei's. "I'm standing right here. They're not. You made this choice when you packed dirt over that woman's face." A new sound cut through the clearing. Another engine, closer, coming fast. Victor's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Single vehicle, coming in hot from the north. Dimitri?" Roberto stood. "Positions. Let him come all the way in." His men faded back into the shadows, weapons trained on the access road. The 4 men in the clearing remained on their knees, hands on their heads. Headlights pierced the fog. A black SUV crashed through the underbrush, skidded to a stop at the clearing's edge. The door flew open. A man stepped out, tall, wearing an expensive suit that looked wrong in the forest. His face was angular, sharp. His eyes scanning the scene, the open grave. His men on their knees, the blood-soaked shoulder of the wounded one. Then those eyes found Roberto. And Dmitry Volkov understood exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. Dmitry Volkov's hand moved toward his jacket. He stopped when 6 red laser dots appeared on his chest, crawling across the expensive fabric like luminescent insects. "I wouldn't," Roberto said quietly. Dmitry's hand slowly returned to his side. His face remained composed, but his eyes were calculating, measuring distances, counting opponents, running through scenarios that all ended badly. "You're making a mistake," Dmitry said. His voice was smooth, educated, the kind that came from private schools and business degrees. "Whatever these idiots told you, whatever they promised, they told me you ordered a woman buried alive," Roberto interrupted, "because she wouldn't sell her land." Dmitry's expression didn't change. Property disputes get complicated. Sometimes persuasion requires creativity. Creativity. Roberto's voice went colder. "Is that what you call suffocating a mother while her 8-year-old daughter watches?" For the first time, something flickered across Dmitry's face. Surprise. The girl wasn't supposed to have escaped. She was supposed to have been found later. Another body in another shallow grave. "The girl's alive?" Dmitry asked. "Very much so," Roberto replied. "So is her mother, which means you failed." Dmitry's jaw tightened. He looked at his 4 men kneeling in the dirt, at the wounded one still clutching his shoulder. "Who are you?" "Someone who stopped when the girl asked for help." Understanding dawned in Dmitry's eyes. His posture shifted subtly, tension becoming something closer to fear. "You're Medino, Roberto Medino." Roberto didn't confirm or deny. He didn't need to. "This is a misunderstanding," Dmitry said quickly. "If I'd known you had any interest in the Mesa woman, I never would have. You would have done exactly what you did." Roberto cut him off. "Because you thought no one important would care about some woman living on a dirt road. You thought you could bury her, take her land, and disappear into your network." "It's just business," Dmitry insisted. "The land is worth—" "I don't care what it's worth." Roberto's voice was ice. "Tell me about your operation." Dmitry's face hardened. "I don't answer to you." Roberto nodded once. Victor moved behind Dmitry, swift and efficient, grabbed his arms and forced them behind his back. Plastic restraints appeared, cinched tight around his wrists. Dmitry struggled, but Victor was stronger, older, had done this 1,000 times. "Then you'll answer to someone else," Roberto said. "Take him to the warehouse. Take all of them." His men moved quickly. The 4 kneeling men were zip-tied, hauled to their feet. The wounded one screamed as rough hands pulled him upright. They were loaded into their own vehicles, evidence that would disappear, just like they would. Dmitry was shoved into the back of Roberto's car. Victor slid in beside him, weapon resting casually across his lap. Roberto remained in the clearing for a moment after the vehicles left. Alone except for Andrei, who stayed as backup. The open grave sat between them, dark and empty. "Fill it," Roberto said quietly. Andrei grabbed one of the abandoned shovels and started pushing dirt back into the pit. The sound of earth hitting earth was loud in the silence, rhythmic and final. Roberto watched until the grave was level again, until you couldn't tell anything had been disturbed except for the fresh soil. Some wounds couldn't be hidden, but this one could be buried. The warehouse on 5th Street had been abandoned for years officially. Unofficially, it served purposes that didn't appear on any paperwork. Roberto arrived 20 minutes after the others, parking in the loading bay where trucks used to deliver goods that no longer existed. Inside, the space was cavernous and dark, except for a circle of light in the center. Dmitry sat in a metal chair, hands still bound, surrounded by Roberto's men. The 4 others were separated, each in a different corner, far enough apart they couldn't coordinate stories. Roberto walked into the light. Dmitry looked up, trying to maintain composure, but sweat glistened on his forehead. "I can make this worth your while," Dmitry said immediately. "The operation I manage moves serious money. Millions monthly. You let me walk, I'll cut you in. 20% of everything that moves through this region." Roberto pulled up a chair, sat facing Dmitry. "Tell me about the network." Dmitry's eyes narrowed. "Why do you care? This isn't your territory." "It became my territory when that little girl stopped my car," Roberto said. "Now talk. Start with who you answer to." Dmitry laughed bitter, sharp. "You think I'm the top? I'm middle management. I coordinate shipments, manage local issues, handle acquisitions. I don't make policy, I execute it." "Who does make policy?" "People you don't want to meet." Dmitry leaned forward as much as his restraints allowed. "People who won't appreciate you interfering with their operations." Roberto's expression didn't change. Names. Kill me if you want, Dimitri said. But I give you those names. I'm dead anyway. At least your way is quick. Roberto studied him. Dimitri believed what he was saying, the fear was genuine, which meant whoever ran this network had a reputation for making examples of people who talked. How many routes run through this region? Roberto asked, changing tactics. 3 major ones, 2 minor. Dimitri relaxed slightly, thinking he'd found safe ground. The Mesa land sits on the primary route. Cuts travel time by 40 minutes, saves fuel costs, reduces exposure on main roads. How much money moves through that route monthly? 4, maybe 5 million in product. Another 2 in laundered cash. Dimitri's voice carried a hint of pride. It's one of the most profitable corridors in the network, and one woman's refusal to sell threatened all of that, Roberto said. She was offered fair market value. Double, actually. Dimitri's tone turned defensive. She refused. Multiple times. We tried intimidation, dead animals, broken windows, threats. She still wouldn't sell. So we escalated. To murder. To persuasion, Dimitri corrected. She wasn't supposed to die. The plan was to bury her for a few hours, dig her up before real damage occurred, and convince her that next time we wouldn't be so merciful. But you changed the plan, Roberto said. Dimitri's silence was confirmation. You decided it was cleaner to just let her die, Roberto continued. Blame it on local criminals, take the land through probate, and eliminate the daughter as a loose end. It would have worked, Dimitri muttered. If that kid hadn't... He stopped, realizing what he was admitting. Roberto stood slowly. He walked around Dimitri's chair, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. How many properties have you acquired this way? I don't keep count. Guess. 7, maybe 8. Dimitri's voice was quieter now. Over 3 years, how many people did you bury? Not all of them were buried. Some were accidents. Some just disappeared. Dimitri looked up at Roberto. This is how the world works. The strong take what they need. The weak either adapt or get removed. Roberto stopped directly behind him. You're right. The strong do take what they need, and the weak get removed. He nodded to Victor. Put him in the basement with the others. Start with the easy questions: financial accounts, property holdings, known associates. Then work your way to the names he doesn't want to give. And if he doesn't talk? Victor asked. Roberto looked at Dimitri one last time. Everyone talks eventually. It's just a question of how much they want to suffer first. 3 days later, Roberto returned to the forest, not to the burial site that ground had been disturbed enough. This time, he drove 40 miles north to a logging outpost that hadn't processed timber in 5 years. The property belonged to a shell company that belonged to another shell company that eventually traced back to Dimitri's network. Remote, isolated, perfect. 2 cargo vans sat in the gravel lot outside the main building. Roberto's men had been here since dawn, preparing. When Roberto stepped out of his car, Victor emerged from the warehouse, wiping his hands on a rag. They're inside, Victor said. All 7 of them. 7. Roberto had learned a lot in 3 days. The 4 men from the forest clearing, Dimitri, and 2 others who'd been involved in previous burials, men whose names the lookout had given up after minimal persuasion. Are they talking? Roberto asked, trying to negotiate, offering money, connections, information on other operations. Victor shrugged. The usual. Roberto nodded. And the accounts? Frozen as of this morning. Every bank account, cryptocurrency wallet, and offshore holding connected to Dimitri's name or his known aliases. Victor allowed himself a small smile. He's going to wake up penniless. If he wakes up at all. They walked toward the building. The morning was cold, the sky overcast but no fog, just gray clouds pressing down like a lid on the world. Inside, the warehouse smelled of old wood and machine oil. Sunlight filtered through dirty windows high up on the walls, creating dusty beams that cut through the darkness. The 7 men were separated into individual spaces, some in old offices, some in storage rooms, all of them bound to chairs, all of them looking tired, scared, some showing signs of Victor's questioning methods. Roberto went to Dimitri first. The man looked worse than he had 3 days ago. His expensive suit was rumpled, stained. His face was bruised, one eye swollen, partially shut, but his jaw was still set, his eyes still defiant. Come to kill me? Dimitri asked when Roberto entered the small office. Roberto pulled up a chair, sat down. That depends. On what? On whether you understand what you did wrong. Dimitri laughed dry, bitter. I buried someone who was in my way. In our world, that's called Tuesday. Your mistake wasn't burying her, Roberto said quietly. It was underestimating the 8-year-old girl who loved her. Dimitri's expression flickered. The girl was collateral damage. Regrettable, but necessary. No, Roberto corrected. The girl was a witness, a survivor, a human being who ran 5 miles barefoot through a forest because she refused to watch her mother die. His voice hardened. And you called that collateral damage. What do you want me to say? Dimitri's defiance cracked slightly. That I'm sorry? That I feel bad? I don't. I did what needed to be done for the operation. Roberto studied him. 3 days of questioning, and Dimitri still didn't understand. Still thought this was about territory or money or respect. He didn't see that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Did you dig the grave yourself? Roberto asked. No. I supervised. Did you put the gag in her mouth? No. Did you pack the dirt over her face? Dimitri hesitated. I helped. Roberto nodded slowly. So you stood there while a woman begged for her life, while her daughter screamed, and you packed dirt over her face until she couldn't breathe. She wouldn't sell, Dimitri said, voice rising. What was I supposed to do? Let her destroy a root worth millions because she had sentimental attachment to some worthless land? You were supposed to be human, Roberto said quietly. But you chose to be something else. He stood, walked to the door. Wait, Dimitri called. You're going to kill me, aren't you? That's what this is about. You brought us all here too. I brought you here so you could understand something, Roberto interrupted. He turned back. You told your men to make that woman dig her own grave before you buried her. Do you remember that? Dimitri's face went pale. Alexei told me, Roberto continued. Said you thought it was poetic, making her participate in her own death. That was just, Dimitri stumbled over his words. So today, you're going to dig, Roberto said. All 7 of you. Not graves, just holes. Deep enough that you understand what it feels like to prepare for your own burial. You're insane, Dimitri whispered. No, Roberto replied. I'm teaching a lesson your parents should have taught you. Actions have consequences. Fear is not a business model, and cruelty is not strength. They brought the 7 men outside 2 hours later. The sun had broken through the clouds, turning the clearing behind the warehouse harsh and bright. Shovels lay in the dirt, 7 of them, rusted but functional. Roberto's men formed a loose perimeter, weapons visible but not raised. The message was clear. Try to run, and you won't make it 10 feet. Dig, Roberto ordered. This is insane, one of the men protested. We've been tied up for 3 days. We can barely stand. Nancy Mesa was buried alive after being beaten and bound for hours, Roberto said flatly. She still managed to survive long enough for her daughter to find help. You can manage to dig a hole. The men looked at each other. One of them, Alexei, picked up a shovel with shaking hands. The others followed slowly, reluctantly. They dug for hours. The sun climbed higher, turned the clearing into an oven. Sweat soaked through their clothes. Blisters formed on their hands. The holes grew deeper, 3 feet, then 4, then 5. Dimitri was the slowest. His expensive shoes kept slipping on the loose dirt. His hands bled from where the shovel handle rubbed skin raw. He kept stopping, gasping, leaning on the shovel like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Keep digging, Roberto said each time he paused. When the holes were finally deep enough 6 feet down, the traditional depth, Roberto ordered them to stop. The 7 men climbed out, collapsing at the edges of their holes. Some were crying, some were too exhausted to do anything but breathe. Roberto walked among them, looking down at each hole. Perfect graves, deep enough to bury a body, deep enough to make a point. Now you know, Roberto said quietly. You know what it feels like to prepare for death, to stand at the edge of nothing and realize how small you are. Dimitri looked up from where he'd collapsed. Are you going to kill us? Roberto was silent for a long moment. The forest around them was quiet except for heavy breathing and the occasional sob. No, he finally said. You're going to leave. All of you. Tonight. You're going to disappear so completely that no one in this region ever hears your names again. His voice went cold. Because if I hear that any of you are still operating here, still threatening people, still using fear as currency, I'll come back. And next time, you'll actually fill those holes. The 7 men scattered like insects when light hits them. Roberto watched from the warehouse as they stumbled toward the vehicles his men had prepared, old trucks with no GPS, no trackers, nothing that could lead back to this place. Each man was given cash, new identification, and a map highlighting routes that led far from this region. and each was given a warning: disappear or be disappeared. Dimitri was the last to leave. He stood beside the truck's open door, looking back at Roberto with eyes that had lost all their earlier defiance. His expensive suit was destroyed, his hands wrapped in crude bandages, his face hollow with exhaustion. "I underestimated you," Dimitri said quietly. "No," Roberto replied. "You underestimated that little girl." Dimitri climbed into the truck without another word. The engine turned over, and he drove away, taillights fading into the distance until the forest swallowed them whole. Victor approached once the last vehicle disappeared. "What about the network?" "They'll come looking for Dimitri eventually. Let them look," Roberto said. "By the time they figure out what happened, there won't be anything left to find." He pulled out his phone, made a call. The voice that answered was female, professional, efficient. "The accounts?" Roberto asked. "Completely drained," she confirmed. 47 million across all holdings. Cryptocurrency, offshore banks, shell company assets, all liquidated within the last 6 hours. The money's been distributed to 14 different charities, none of which can be traced back to you. And the properties? 17 holdings connected to the network. I've initiated legal challenges on 12 of them: environmental violations, zoning disputes, tax irregularities. The other 5 are being sold to legitimate buyers at market value, proceeds going to the same charities. Roberto allowed himself a small nod. The land Nancy Mesa owned? Already transferred to a conservation trust. She can't sell it now even if she wanted to. It's protected wilderness in perpetuity. Good. Roberto ended the call. Victor was watching him with something close to admiration. "You just dismantled an entire operation without firing a shot." "I fired several shots," Roberto corrected. 3 days ago in the forest." "You know what I mean." Victor gestured toward where the trucks had disappeared. "You could have killed them. Most people would have. Most people don't have to live with the sound of a child screaming as they drive away," Roberto said quietly. He walked back to his car. The logging outpost would be cleaned within hours, every trace of what happened here erased. The building itself scheduled for demolition next month. By this time next year, trees would reclaim the clearing, and no one would remember it had ever existed. Some things deserved to be forgotten. The calls started that evening. Roberto ignored the first 3 unknown numbers, probably low-level operators trying to understand why accounts weren't accessible, why shipments were delayed, why Dimitri wasn't answering. The 4th call came from a number Roberto recognized. He answered. "You've made a very expensive mistake," the voice said. Older, male, authority wrapped in courtesy. 47 million doesn't just disappear. It does when it never existed legally in the first place. Roberto replied calmly. Silence. Then, "You know who you're talking to?" "Someone who should have trained their people better." Roberto's voice was cold. "Someone whose operation just lost a coordinator, 4 field operatives, and access to a primary route, all because one of your people decided burying women alive was acceptable business practice." Dimitri exceeded his authority, the voice conceded. "That situation would have been handled internally. It's handled now." Another pause. Roberto could hear breathing, calculation happening on the other end of the line. "The Mesa woman's land is worthless now," the voice said. "Protected conservation land can't be sold, can't be used. You've cost us a route and gained nothing." "I gained the knowledge that your operation won't threaten that family again," Roberto said. "That's worth 47 million to me. You're making enemies you don't need." "I'm removing enemies I didn't want." Roberto's tone didn't change. "Your network had 3 routes through this region. You still have 2. Use them. Stay away from small landowners who tell you no. And tell your coordinators that burying people alive is bad for business. And if we don't, then I'll make your other 2 routes disappear the same way I made this one disappear." Roberto's voice dropped lower. "And next time I won't stop at 47 million. He ended the call before the voice could respond. Victor, who'd been listening from across the room, whistled low. "You just threatened someone very dangerous." "No," Roberto corrected. "I just reminded someone very dangerous that there are lines you don't cross. Not for money, not for efficiency, not for any reason. You think they'll listen?" Roberto looked out the window at the darkening sky. "They'll calculate. They'll weigh the cost of revenge against the cost of just avoiding me, and they'll realize it's cheaper to stay away. And if they don't, then we'll have a different conversation." Roberto's expression hardened. "But they'll listen. People like that always do the math. And right now, the math says I'm more expensive than I'm worth." The next morning, Roberto received confirmation. 3 shell companies connected to the smuggling network had filed paperwork to dissolve operations in his region. 2 transport contracts had been canceled. 5 properties were being quietly sold. The network was retreating. Not because they feared Roberto personally, organizations that large didn't fear individuals, but because he'd proven he could make their operations too expensive to maintain. He'd turned their profit center into a liability. That was a language they understood. Roberto forwarded the documents to his accountant, with instructions to monitor for any signs of reorganization. Then he deleted the files from his phone and poured himself coffee. Victor entered the kitchen, tablet in hand. The charities are asking questions. 47 million showing up overnight tends to attract attention. Let them ask, Roberto said. Anonymous donations happen all the time. By the time they trace the money, the accounts it came from will have been closed for weeks. You gave away more than most people make in a lifetime. Roberto sipped his coffee. I didn't give away anything. I returned money that was stolen through violence and fear. The charities will do more good with it than those men ever did. Victor set down the tablet. What about Nancy and Naomi? They still at the safe house? Roberto nodded. For another few days. Then new identities, new city, new start. They're going to ask why. Why you helped. Why you stayed involved. Then I'll tell them the truth, Roberto said quietly. That once, I didn't help. And I've spent 7 years making sure I never make that mistake again. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, set it in the sink. Some debts couldn't be paid, but they could be honored. One choice at a time. The safe house on Meridian Street felt different at dawn. Softer somehow, like the early light stripped away some of the darkness that clung to places where broken people came to heal. Roberto stood outside, watching sunrise paint the brick facade in shades of amber and gold. He'd been driving for an hour, circling the city, making sure no one followed. Old habits, even with the network in retreat, even with Dimitri and his crew scattered to distant cities, caution kept you breathing. Victor had texted 30 minutes ago. Nancy was awake, asking questions, wanting answers before she and Naomi disappeared into new identities that would make them ghosts to everyone who'd known them before. Roberto climbed the steps, knocked twice. The door opened immediately. One of his men, alert despite the early hour, weapon concealed but ready. She's upstairs, the man said. The girl's still sleeping. Roberto nodded, moved through the familiar hallway. The house smelled like coffee now, not antiseptic. Small improvement. He took the stairs slowly, each step creaking under his weight, announcing his presence. Nancy sat in the bedroom's single chair, positioned so she could see both the door and the window. Defensive positioning. She'd learned something from what happened to her. Good. She looked better than she had 3 days ago. Color had returned to her face, though she was still too thin, too fragile looking. The rope burns on her wrists were healing, hidden beneath long sleeves. But her eyes, they carried weight now. Shadows that hadn't been there before. Mr. Medino, she said quietly, not standing. Nancy. Roberto remained in the doorway. How are you feeling? Like I died and came back wrong. Her voice was steady but hollow. The doctor says I'm fine physically, but every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that hole, feeling dirt fill my mouth, hearing my daughter scream as she runs away. Roberto said nothing. There were no words that fixed that kind of damage. They told me what you did, Nancy continued. The men who buried me, Dimitri, the whole operation. Her eyes met his. You destroyed them. I removed them, Roberto corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Nancy's lips formed something that wasn't quite a smile. You took $47 million, froze their assets, scattered their people. That sounds like destruction to me. They can rebuild. Somewhere else. With different methods. Roberto's voice was flat. I just made sure they understood this region and you are off limits. Nancy was quiet for a moment. Then, why? Your daughter asked me to help. No. Nancy shook her head. That's why you stopped. I'm asking why you stayed involved. Why you spent 3 days hunting down everyone connected to what happened. Why you're giving us new identities and a new life. She leaned forward. Men like you don't do things without reason. So what's yours? Roberto stepped into the room, but didn't sit. 7 years ago, a boy ran out of a forest asking for help. I told my driver to keep moving. 3 days later, they found him and his father shot dead in a ditch. Nancy's expression softened. And you've been trying to make up for that ever since. I'm not trying to make up for anything, Roberto said sharply. You can't make up for watching someone die, because you were too concerned with your own problems to care about theirs. He exhaled slowly. But you can make sure it doesn't happen again. So every time a child asks you for help, you stop the world to save them? Yes. Nancy studied him. That's not sustainable. Eventually you'll be asked to help someone you can't save, or someone who doesn't deserve saving. Then I'll deal with that when it happens, Roberto replied. But I won't drive away. Footsteps sounded from the adjoining room. Light, hesitant. Naomi appeared in the doorway, wearing clothes someone had bought for her jeans. A soft gray sweater that made her look even smaller than she was. Her feet were still bandaged from her run through the forest. You came back, she said, looking at Roberto. I said I would. Naomi crossed to her mother, climbed into the chair beside her. Nancy wrapped an arm around her daughter, pulled her close. For a moment, they just held each other, and Roberto felt like an intruder witnessing something private. Are we leaving today? Naomi asked. Tomorrow, Roberto said. Tonight you rest. Tomorrow morning my people will drive you to a new city. You'll have new names, new documents, money to start over. What about our house? Naomi's voice was small. My things? Your things were collected yesterday, Roberto said. Photos, clothes, anything that mattered. It's all being packed for transport. The house itself. He paused. The house is being sold. The land it sits on has been transferred to a conservation trust. No one can build on it or use it for transport routes. Nancy's breath caught. You protected it. I protected what they wanted to take from you, Roberto corrected. The land was never about the land itself. It was about control. Now no one controls it. That was our home, Nancy whispered. Your home tried to kill you, Roberto said bluntly. The men who buried you know where you live, what you look like, what your daughter looks like. Even with Dimitri gone, even with the network in retreat, there's always a chance someone decides to finish what was started. His voice hardened. You don't go back, ever. Naomi looked up at her mother. He's right, Mama. We can't go back. Nancy's eyes filled with tears. She nodded slowly, accepting what she'd probably known since waking up in this safe house. Her old life was over. Everything she'd built, everyone she'd known gone. Where are we going? She asked. You'll find out tomorrow, Roberto said. The less you know now, the less you can accidentally reveal if someone asks questions. Will we ever see you again? Naomi asked suddenly. Roberto looked at the small girl who'd thrown herself in front of his car, who'd run 5 miles barefoot, who'd refused to let her mother die alone in darkness. No, he said honestly. After tomorrow, we won't have contact. It's safer that way. But you'll remember us? Naomi pressed. Something in Roberto's chest tightened. Yes, I'll remember. Good. Naomi seemed satisfied with that answer. She settled against her mother, small and fragile and impossibly brave, because I'll remember you too. The man who stopped. Roberto nodded once. He turned toward the door. Mr. Medino? Nancy's voice stopped him. Thank you. For everything. For stopping. For caring when you didn't have to. For being better than the world that made you. Roberto paused in the doorway. I'm not better than anything, he said quietly. I'm just trying to be less worse than I used to be. He left before either of them could respond. Descended the stairs, nodded to his men, stepped out into morning light that felt too bright, too clean for what he was. But as he drove away from Meridian Street for the last time, he didn't feel the weight he'd carried for 7 years pressing quite so hard against his chest. The boy in the forest was still dead. That would never change. But Naomi Mesa was alive, and sometimes that had to be enough. Roberto drove toward the forest alone. Not the burial site, he'd never return there, but the original road, the stretch where fog had rolled thick, and a barefoot girl had emerged from gray nothing to throw herself in front of his convoy. 4 days had passed since Nancy and Naomi left the safe house. Victor had handled the transport personally, driven them 18 hours to a coastal city where no one would think to look. New names, new papers, a small apartment already furnished, paid for 2 years in advance, enough money in a bank account to rebuild without questions. They were ghosts now, safe because they no longer existed. Roberto pulled his car to the side of the road, the same spot where his convoy had stopped. He stepped out into morning air that was cold but clear. No fog today, just pale sunlight filtering through pine trees that stood like silent witnesses. He walked to where Naomi had collapsed, where she'd begged him not to drive away. The pavement showed nothing, no bloodstains, no evidence that anything significant had happened here. Rain had washed away the marks her feet had left. Wind had scattered the debris from her torn dress. But Roberto remembered every detail. The terror in her eyes, the desperation in her voice, the way she'd looked at him like he was her last hope in a world that had already tried to bury everything she loved. He'd stopped. 7 years of regret. 7 years of that other boy's scream echoing in his memory. And he'd finally stopped. His phone buzzed. A text from Victor. Package delivered. No complications. They're settled. Roberto typed back. Good. Monitor for 3 months. After that, they're on their own. Understood. He pocketed the phone, looked back at the road. In the distance, he could see where the convoy had parked, where his men had emerged with weapons drawn, where he'd stepped out and met the eyes of a child who'd run 5 miles because she refused to accept her mother's death. You stopped for me, Naomi had said in the safe house. Simple words. But they carried weight Roberto was still learning to process. All his life, he'd operated by clear rules. Protect your own, eliminate threats, never show weakness, never get involved in problems that weren't yours to solve. Those rules had kept him alive, kept him powerful, kept him insulated from the messy complications of caring about strangers. But those rules had also cost him sleep, cost him peace, cost him the ability to look at his reflection without seeing a boy's face screaming as a car drove away. Roberto turned away from the road, walked a few steps into the tree line. The forest was quiet here, peaceful. Birds called from hidden branches. Somewhere distant, water ran over rocks, life continuing, indifferent to human violence and human mercy alike. He thought about Dimitri, scattered to some distant city, penniless and broken, about the 4 men who'd dug the grave, who'd packed dirt over a woman's face, now living under assumed names in places they'd never wanted to be, about the network that had retreated, reorganized, continued operating in other regions where no one had stopped them yet. The world hadn't changed. Evil still existed. People still hurt each other for profit, for power, for reasons that made sense only to them. But one woman was alive. One girl wasn't an orphan. And one man had kept a promise he'd made to himself in the dark hours after learning about a boy's body in a ditch. Roberto's phone buzzed again. This time a call, he answered. Boss, we have a situation. It was Andre. There's a woman here, at the office. She says her son is missing. Says she needs help. She's asking for you specifically. Roberto closed his eyes. How did she get my name? Won't say. Just keep saying she heard you help people when no one else will. She's been waiting for 3 hours. Roberto should say no. Should explain he wasn't in the business of solving everyone's problems, that he'd made one exception for one girl, and that didn't make him a resource for everyone with a crisis. But he heard himself say, Tell her I'll be there in 20 minutes. You sure, boss? No. He wasn't sure. Getting involved in strangers' problems was how you attracted attention, made enemies, spread yourself too thin to defend what mattered. But he was tired of being the man who drove away. Tell her I'm coming, Roberto said, and ended the call. He walked back to his car, cast one last look at the road where everything had changed. The fog was gone. The morning was clear. The trees stood in silent approval or judgment, he couldn't tell which, and it didn't matter. Roberto started the engine, pulled back onto the pavement. As he drove away, he thought about the woman waiting at his office, desperate for help with a missing son. Thought about what getting involved would cost, what complications it would create, what dangers it would invite. And he thought about a barefoot girl running through fog, refusing to let her mother die alone. Some choices echoed. Some decisions changed trajectories in ways you couldn't predict or control. Roberto didn't know if he was making the right choice. Didn't know if constantly stopping, constantly helping, constantly intervening would eventually destroy him. But he knew he'd rather be destroyed trying to help than preserved by walking away. The road ahead was clear, the forest receding in his rearview mirror. Somewhere behind him, a grave stood empty and forgotten. Somewhere ahead, a woman waited for a man who'd learned too late for some, just in time for others that stopping was always an option. Even when it was hard. Even when it was dangerous. Even when every instinct screamed to keep driving. Roberto pressed the accelerator, aimed toward the city, toward another crisis, another plea, another chance to be the person he'd failed to be 7 years ago. The fog was gone, but Roberto Medino had finally learned to see through it, and he would keep stopping. For as long as people kept asking, for as long as he could remember the sound of a girl's voice saying, "You stopped for me," because some debts could never be fully paid, but they could be honored. One stop at a time, Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.